We're really pleased to have Sarah Finney present today. Sarah is the second of our new colleagues in the applied linguistics community that is giving a talk here at CARLA. She's a recent graduate of the University of Alabama, and she's currently coordinating the 1003 courses in Spanish. And so today she's going to be talking about creating an immersive language learning experience through role-immersion pedagogy. So please welcome Sarah.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all. Well, thank you for coming today. I did not know it was snowing out, so yay! And thank you, CARLA, for inviting me to talk a little bit about my research. So like Kate said, this is a presentation on creating an immersive learning environment through role-immersion pedagogy. So first I'll just share a little bit about how I've organized the talk. So I'll start by just sharing a little bit about what is role-immersion pedagogy for those who may not be familiar with it. And then because I implemented this pedagogy in an intermediate level classroom, I want to talk a little bit about why would role immersion be appropriate for the lower division foreign language classes. And then I'll just move right into the study that I conducted. So I'll give a brief overview, share the research questions, the methodology, the findings or results, and then the conclusions and pedagogical implications. Okay, so quickly, has anyone here heard of role immersion? Okay, some people. How do you know about it? Have you used it? Just out of curiosity.
From a previous presentation of yours.
Oh, okay. I'm getting around. Okay.
There's a German professor in Indiana who does theater pedagogy.
Okay.
Drama pedagogy.
Okay. Sure. And then was there someone, Joy?
I've used it a little bit in my second year classes at a different university, just in an unstructured way. Like you are a people recommend to the indigenous activists from Guatemala, and then you are someone opposed to indigenous rights. You know?
Okay, sure.
Just
Sure.
kind of like that. Just play different you're playing a different role.
Okay, okay. Well, so some people have an idea. So I'll just give you a little bit of background on where it started. So it started with a program or initiative called Reacting to the Past, which actually takes place in the discipline of history. It's expanded due to, I guess, folks really liking it. It's expanded to a lot of disciplines. But basically what happens is students adopt roles of personas. In reacting, it's historical figures, right? And so these personas or figures are informed by classic texts, or it can be modern text, as well as real-world contextual pillars. So it's situated in a particular scenario. And then students participate in an elaborate, and it's reacting is completely student run. You'll see I modified it some. But it's a simulation mirroring a real-world scenario. Like I said, it's entirely run by students in some versions. And then it usually lasts weeks, or it can be even longer. So I want to just give you this is a 2-minute video sharing where some students shared their perspective. And you have to keep in mind, this is Reacting to the Past, which I modified for foreign language. But it's 2 minutes just to give you a sense of how students perceive this pedagogy.
Reacting to the Past is a really fantastic and unique experience. It looks at history in a whole new way. You're not sitting there listening to a teacher lecture. You're not sitting there taking notes. It's not just memorizing dates and memorizing principles.
You're embodying this character that you only just reading in a textbook.
Really throws you into the time period.
It's unlike any other class I've ever taken. It doesn't feel like school.
We walk into class, talking, friendly. You sit down. It's go time.
You forget that you're not actually in India in 1946.
Everyone kind of wants to win at all costs.
You have to do whatever it takes.
Beginning of the game, all the characters are thrown into this conference at Simla.
The purpose of us all meeting is so that we can talk to the Governors General and say, this is what we want to happen in India, and this is what we're hoping you can do for us.
I really came in knowing nothing about India other than that it was a British colony.
Didn't know anything about all the debates, the partitioning, the characters.
I really didn't know what to expect.
The INC operates on a pragmatic level. We are striving and have been striving for a unified India since its conception.
I will touch some of the INC. There is one way in which the minority groups are united. We do not want to be Hindu.
Preparing for the role is sort of studying for yourself. you want to know as much as possible. You want to out-read and out-research them.
That's why you learn history so well in reacting. You have to go out and really do your homework. Otherwise, you're going to get crushed.
And it makes you want to work outside of class and just invest as much time as possible in it.
I never really get curious about what's going on because it's so compelling all the time. I'm never stressed in this class, but I'm always having fun.
It's a wonderful, terrifying kind of investment that you come to time.
They teach you how to build coalitions, how to work with people of competing ideologies, leadership skills, public speaking. You have to understand things from all points of view. It's skills that you can really take with you in life.
I think reacting to the past is more engaging than any other class I've taken because of the way that it puts the student in control. You can feel empowered and feel like you're making a difference.
You really not only get to know the history better, but you get to know these people so much better than any other class I've taken. I think, my closest friends to this class.
So that gives you a sense of where I got the inspiration for doing this in foreign language learning. So then I want to move into why would we want to do something like this in a lower division foreign language class? And there have been some calls in the field for a learning experience that's more integrated, experiential, and holistic. And so I'll just go through a little bit of this before I get into the study. So first of all, there have been folks that have been talking about, okay, how can we make foreign language learning more of an integrated learning experience instead of just focusing on language? And I think that the 5 C's that ACTFL puts out kind of exemplifies this. How can we focus on communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, communities? We're all striving to do this, and yet it's kind of a tall task. And then experiential. So, when we think of experiential learning when it comes to foreign language learning, we often might think of study abroad or an immersive camp, something like that. And so role immersion sort of provides this, what we would call a direct access to the object of study, but instead of doing it, actually doing it, we use the imagination, and you kind of got that sense from the video we just saw, right? So kind of transcending our time and space. I have this quote from Wenger, and envisioning hopefully new images of ourselves, of other people that are very unfamiliar to us, and of the world. The other thing about experiential learning is that it taps into a variety of sensory channels. So often the intellectual capacity is present in academic settings, right? But when it comes to the emotional or affective realm, or taking action in some way, those are often elusive, and I think sometimes we lose the human element that is very real when it comes to foreign language learning outside the classroom or foreign language use. And then lastly, as you can kind of sense, this is a more holistic approach to foreign language learning. And so I just want to mention that I adopted an ecological vision of the classroom, and that's based on an ecology, right? So essentially it allows us to consider the totality of the learning experience as opposed to isolating variables, which many of us are familiar with. And so what you're studying then is the relationships between the various organisms and their environment. And this is sort of an alternate to the cause-effect paradigm. So it allows us to look at a lot of different things. So I want to mention the term affordance because it comes up in my research questions. A relationship between a learner and the environment, and it's a relationship that signals the opportunity for or inhibition of action. Essentially, that's what is there to do something with, and do students do something with it, right? And so that's sort of the orientation that I took for this study. Okay, so the current study, as you can imagine, at an intermediate level Spanish class, we could not do something like what reacting to the past is. They read hundreds of pages, right, and that's just far beyond our reach. So what I did was I took this reacting to the past idea and merged it with global simulation. And so that really helped to allow for scaffolding of information, of content, of language resources. It's also a lot slower, right, than what we saw there, but in the end, what you saw in the video is very similar to where my students got, well, they weren't my students, I was not the instructor of record, but where those students got or the way that they were interacting at the end of the simulation. So the content that I selected was a US-Mexico border role immersion simulation. And this was a simulation that was developed by Bridget Franco, a colleague of mine, for a US Latino Studies course. And the reason that I chose this particular, and she's a content expert, I mean, her studies are US Latino relations and Latin American literature. And so she developed this simulation. She's familiar with reacting as well. And the reason I chose this one was because I think that what my hope was that it could bring stereotypes to the surface and problematize them. Specifically at the US-Mexico border, you can imagine students may not even be aware that they have these stereotypes, especially we're dealing with typically 18 to 22-year-old US students, right? And then the other thing that I was hoping to achieve was to present a variety of perspectives with the aim of deepening learners' understanding of the complexity inherent in any scenario, but in this particular scenario. And it was also geographically relevant, which research has suggested can help pique learners' interests. So the premise of this particular simulation was a summit is called at the US-Mexico border, and all stakeholders are invited to propose solutions to the complex problems of drug trafficking and violence at the border. Okay? And I should mention that although this was implemented about 4 years ago, so it was sort of present day then, this content is circa 2010. So it's not really we're not talking about history per se, but as you can imagine, since 2014, this game was published in 2012, the landscape at the border has changed drastically. So this is I think that's important to note. When I did this, it was I would say a slightly different political and economic landscape. Okay, so some of the characters, each student has an individual character, so I wanted to give everyone a sample of what the characters are. So there were 2 United Nations representatives, and those characters would sort of direct the 2 caucuses, which I'll talk about later. And then there were political figures, so the US and Mexican presidents, the El Paso and Juarez mayors, among others. Civilians and law enforcement characters included a US business owner with financial and business stake at the border, a border factory worker, a Mexican activist and poet, and the Juarez chief of police. This is just, every student had a character, but that's just to give you a sense. Okay, so moving into my research questions. My first interest was their overall impression. So this was a new pedagogy. This was the first time implementing it in an intermediate classroom. So what were learners' overall impressions? So that was my first research question, sort of guiding the rest of my research. And then I also looked at the 2 hallmarks of role immersion. The first being that students receive a lot of liberty, I'm calling it agency here, autonomy, to kind of engage however they want with the content with their peers. And so that's research question 2. And then research question 3 and 4 focus on another hallmark of the pedagogy, which is the adoption of an alternate subjectivity. So you're operating not from your own perspective, but from this perspective of someone else. And so today I'm just going to focus on these 2. So I want to just say the research questions. So what were learners' overall impressions of the simulation? What affordances emerged or not from adopting an alternate identity? And then what factors limited affordances related to this? And we'll look at those in a minute. So this was a 4th semester Spanish course at a southeastern university. That would be the equivalent of 1004 here, right? It was 4 weeks long. There were 16 participants, and it was conducted entirely in Spanish. The introduction and permission to participate in the study was done in English, and then students were also highly encouraged to ask questions after class. Often we'd leave about 5 minutes. The instructor would leave about 5 minutes to do that. If they were really struggling with what to do, or and many students did take advantage of that. But the classes themselves were all in Spanish. And the simulation was divided into 4 phases. So I want to just go over those 4 phases so that you know sort of the trajectory of students. So the first phase was students engaged with authentic texts. I also modified some of the text from Bridget Franco's simulation, but I added videos, authentic text. They did in-class discussions as well as out-of-class research for their roles. They also engaged with into some discussions about stereotypes, watched some videos on that, and they also had learned about the historical context leading up to the present day, circa 2010, border situation. So that was phase one. Phase two kind of overlapped with phase one. So as they're engaging with this content, they also selected and built their characters. So each student had to choose 3 characters that they were interested in adopting or taking on and then provide a rationale. Most students got one of their top 3, and if they didn't, the instructor looked at the rationale that they gave and tried to find something that it was in line with that. And that's important too with relationship to the agency, having them have ownership over who they're becoming. And then they built a profile for their character on the technology platform Google+, which has just been eliminated. So this was their ability, this was their chance to kind of make it their own, right? You have these contextual, some confining pillars, right, that make this person situated in this scenario, but there are some creative liberties you could take as well. And so then that brings us to phase 3, which were 2 completely learner-driven, learner-run classes. And during this time, like I said, there were 2 caucuses run by the UN representatives, and essentially students were to propose solutions, debate, figure out how to create 2 proposals to combat the very many problems they had spent the last 2 weeks learning about. And so they talked obviously in class, but they also interacted outside of class via Google+. So they were sending, trying to solidify alliances, trying to convince people to come to their side, things like that. And then the final class was them finalizing and voting on the proposal. If it aligned with their character's agenda, right, they would vote for, and if not, they would vote against. So that moves us into the data analysis. To analyze the data for these 3 research questions, I used constructivist grounded theory. And so all of these were self-reported data. So my agency data was a separate group. So I did pre and post questionnaires, 2 post interviews. And what I did was I looked for recurring words and themes and identified patterns. And from those patterns, I created and labeled categories. So research question 1, what were learners' overall impressions? What I found was that there were 2 orientations. 10 learners described their impression of the simulation as similar to a real-world experience. 6 learners described it as an academic exercise to practice language. So we'll look at the data from this one first. So these students used terms like real. 2 of the students that had actually spent extensive time abroad compared the simulation to their time abroad. They used words like practical, immersing, and they kept using the term actual conversation. We were actually engaging with real content, et cetera, et cetera. And they also these 10 students, to sort of get their point across, compared what they understood the simulation to be to a traditional class. They actually used the words traditional, textbook, normal class, and memorized. And so I think it's hard to articulate these kinds of ideas, so they use those comparisons to try and do so. On the other hand, the academic group didn't use any of those sorts of comments. Instead, they used phrases like, I learned new words, I practiced vocabulary speaking and listening, and 2 students indicated that they felt their linguistic abilities stayed the same. So that gives you a sense of what they talked about in the questionnaires. So looking at research question 3, what affordances emerged from adopting an alternate identity? What I found was that there were 2 sort of approaches, or like an affordance that emerged for some students but did not emerge for another group. So the first group, establishing common ground with their character, these students found a way to relate in some way to their character, and the other group instead projected their own life onto the character. So they had 2 different approaches to their character building when they were building their character. And what I noticed was that without any exceptions, that the 10 learners who adopted approach 1, all 10 of them showed some, albeit maybe minor, progression toward involvement or empathy, whereas the other 6 students did not show that type of progression. So First, we'll look at the data for those that established common ground. So like I said, they often turn to stereotypes or something that they related to with the character. So one student said, I looked up names that meant power, and she was stereotyping her government official, right? One thing she knew about the US Secretary of State was that it's a powerful position. Another student said, I want to teach literature, so I figured I'd infuse that into him because he's also a poet. And that probably also led that student to choose that character, right? One other student said, I chose a protest photo to send a message that she was trying to change things. So again, she kind of connected with this activist part of her character role, and then that's helped her start sort of building the person. And the business owner said, I was a lion trying to win. I thought California was close enough to the border that it would have some relevance trying to get this binational city. So he's thinking about, okay, I have some real bottom line goals here. So he kind of associated that with, and this student was a business student as well. The other students instead just projected their own life onto their characters. So they said things like, I was just like Shauna, where in 20 years, what are you doing, right? Another student said, because she's short and has black hair, that's what she did for her character. And one student said, it's a fake life based on what I might want in the future. Obviously, I want to be married the same as I want my life. That's my real life. I love California. So this student made her character from California, even though her character was the mayor of El Paso, Texas. So that gives you a sense of sort of the difference, right? So just sort of things that maybe you would change if you were thinking about that a little more critically. So looking then at the post-simulation, so first, before I share what they did, the post-simulation, I want to share their pre-comments. Because before I started the simulation, I asked students to share their thoughts on the border, on Mexico. And so what we found was that in the pre-questionnaire, 14 out of 16 learners stereotyped Mexicans. 2 learners did not. So the 14 students used words like hardworking, family-friendly, vibrant culture. We saw these sort of concepts that are very generalized, repeated over and over. They also, all 16 learners stereotyped Mexico, poverty, beaches, drugs, and vacation. So we see there were 2 students that didn't stereotype Mexicans, which you would think, okay, so maybe that's going to have an incidence on the end result, but they were in separate categories. So one is in the empathy group and one is in the non-empathy group. So I would need more data to know if that really plays a role. So then after the simulation, what were students saying? So the ones that sort of made progression toward a deeper understanding said things like, I understand the challenges of Mexico better because I understand more of what the government has had to overcome and deal with these huge problems. So interestingly, this student empathized or understood from a government perspective, right? Because she was a government official. Another student said, Mexican culture wants peace and doesn't like to be associated with poverty and violence. So this student in her pre-questionnaire literally wrote, I associate Mexico with poverty and violence. And so what we see is, okay, there's, I would argue small, but still notable progression to the fact that, okay, this is sort of humanizing in a sense of, no one wants poverty and violence, obviously, but see, this is what we need to raise these to their awareness and then sort of help them recognize it, and that's part of sort of learning about stereotypes. Another student said, I empathize more with their situation on the border and their situation in the cities with drugs and violence. So this student sort of recognized that on the border, these are sort of particular issues. And we still see an us-them, right? You still see the us-them dichotomy, which I think is important to note. And one student said, it gave me more human lens through which to see the country and its people. So we see some sort of progression there. On the other group, their post-questionnaire comments didn't include any of those types of comments that we just saw. So I looked, what did they talk about, right? And so I found 3 trends among these learners. The first was just sort of generalized statements. So this is an example, money is the motivator for everything. So just generalized things that maybe you would argue are kind of cliche. They also focused on language. So one student said, I can speak better than the other kids. And focusing on achieving objectives. These students tended to say things about having an objective or an agenda in the game. And so what I wanted to look at with research question 4 was, well, why? What was limiting these students from, either what was limiting these students? And So I went back and looked through the data and to look at why there was this disconnect, and I found a couple of things. So the first was there was a desire for more or less guidance. That was a recurring theme. So they described the simulation or the directions as vague. We were not given enough information. One student in this group said, I disliked being limited, I had to follow my criteria. So instead of wanting more guidance, which I would think would be, you would think would be the more likely preference, he wanted to go into some fantasy world where he was not confined by any sort of contextual pillars. And then lastly, these students' views remain tied to their real world experiences. And so one student described the simulation as fabricated, even though, like I said, the content, the videos, many of the texts were authentic. So that was sort of interesting. And then somebody else said, my preconceived ideas were mostly accurate. So keeping with whatever she came into the class with, he or she. And so I think, that sort of speaks to this didn't really come to life for those students, right? They're still sort of separating it. So before I move into my conclusions and sort of wrap up and open it up to questions, I want to go back to the big picture of the overall impressions. So I didn't share my agency data with you, but I think it's sort of relevant to get a full picture. So what I found was that students who progressed in agency, which I'll explain that if anyone's interested, but and progressed emotionally or with, progressing somewhat toward empathy or solidarity, all 10 of these learners did both. Whereas the 6 either progressed agentively or progressed toward empathy, but they did not do both. So I thought that was an interesting finding. So the conclusions more related to the character adoption is that using stereotypes to initially understand characters was a point of departure for understanding the unfamiliar and progressing toward empathy or solidarity, which was a surprising finding for me. And this idea of even just a small progression, if you think about if we did that in all of our foreign language classes, we might see those opportunities being sort of acted on. And then, not saying we don't, but ideal world. And then progressing toward empathy and solidarity is a dual process. So what does that mean? It means that students need opportunities to explore the unfamiliar, and they also need opportunities to practice subjectivity experientially. So what I was thinking is that role immersion would be some amazing pedagogy that would just catapult learners into being global citizens. That did not happen, but and I think I underestimated the former there. So just giving them opportunities to sort of connect in some way with the unfamiliar. And then lastly, I think what this highlights is that there is a disconnect for students between the academic realm and the real world. They see them as separate, and that was noted by that first data. And so I think that points to the potential for pedagogies like role immersion because students described it as relevant, practical, and real world, and then contrasted that with their experience of many classes. Pedagogical implications, I think that we often overlook the need to create a personal connection in our classes, particularly in foreign language learning, and the opportunities for reflection can be a good place for that. It was very challenging to have a reflective moment in that 4 weeks of the role immersion because we all have those pressures of getting things done in an efficient way. And then preparation for curricular shifts. As you can imagine, this was a huge shift for students. And I think it's really important whenever we're doing a curricular shift to really think about not only what students are doing in the class, but how comfortable they feel about what they're doing. I would have never known, because I was observing the class that did this study, I would have never known that those 6 students were different than the other 10. They all look the same, right? But there's these underlying things going on. And as we found out, that many of them were actually uncomfortable with the liberties they were given in the class. And so really helping students navigate that, especially at the beginning, is important. So with that, I am done. I'll open it up for questions. Yeah, Kate.
I wonder if you could tell us how the simulation fit within the rest of the course curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm getting the impression that it was maybe like a standalone
Yep.
thing. And yeah, we just talk about that and how students were assessed
Mm-hmm.
for this.
So the way that I did it for this study, which I would probably modify in the future, was that it was sort of a culminating, because this was the end of their 4th semester, so it was almost like a mini bridge course to get them starting to shift into their upper level courses. And so we did an expedited version of the class and eliminated certain parts of the curricular components to fit it into, what would that be, 11 weeks instead of a 15-week class. And then this was sort of seen as, you're catapulting you into your next kind of phase. And so that was the first question. The second, how were they evaluated? So I have to remember, because this was a while ago. So we used mostly rubrics. So they did an in-class presentation. They had out-of-class writing to communicate on Google+. So that was their out-of-class writing. They had sort of homework assignments, so they had to do outside research on something that was interesting to them. Looking at the different topics, so that was like some homework grades. And then the major part of their assessment was probably the 3 days of where it was student driven, and so that was a rubric, and I should have put it on my PowerPoint. But they were evaluated on strategy was one. There were 4 categories, and now I'm gonna think about it. Strategy was one. The language was just to remain in Spanish. That was the only requirement for the language, because as you can imagine, you're impromptu, spontaneous, and so that we weren't looking for as much for accuracy on that. And then I'm trying to think, I can look, but yeah. But it was a rubric-based assessment.
I just want to share that a week ago today, I participated in a role-play simulation in English. And it was about global climate change. And it was like the UN climate talks. And I found myself, I was representing countries in South America, and I was doing all this homework the night before. I was reading stuff, I was trying to inform myself so that I would be able to say something when I stood up. And I found my engagement, it was great. And then the actual experience, you know, some of it you have your facts and all that, but a lot of it then is this play acting and kind of having fun.
Yeah, right.
Having fun with it. But the other thing I wanted to point out was that the simulation that was created by MIT and someone else, it's been translated into 7 different languages.
Oh, wow.
So if someone wanted to do
that's great.
Simulation, it's ready to go.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. That's been my experience as well. I participated in the Reacting to the Past Institute last summer, and I played art in Paris. So I was Van Gogh, who is an erratic artist, you know, so I found myself doing the same thing. I learned a lot more about art than I ever thought I would, so. Yeah.
You said if you did it again, you wouldn't include it as a capstone at the end. How might you include this in your class in the future?
So I think that there are a lot of ways to do that. One thing I would probably, my first shift would be to have both content and language objectives. Because this was the first time, well, the second time I did a pilot study implementing it, I just didn't want to take all of that on, but I think that based on what literature says about having content and language, I would more seamlessly integrate the two. Some students mentioned that casually. That wasn't a trend in the data, but I think that would help sort of do both. And we're talking about this language content divide, and so that would be the first thing I would do. And then I also think you would just have to make sure that, you know, it fits into the curriculum. So figuring out how that works, I guess, would depend on the class. And so did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I feel like with innovative pedagogies, the thing that always comes out is that buy-in is the most important component to learning.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could just like comment on what do you think like gets students to buy in? What, like, I don't know, suggestions do you have about trying to earn buy-in? Because it really seems so important for learning.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's
Yeah.
really
Well,
big.
no, I mean, you're making me think. I mean, it is hard because I'm thinking about, I think that in large part, students were bought in. But you have these sort of this small group, and maybe it would be a large group in some other class, I don't know, of students who maybe are feeling pushed. It's almost like the intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, right? So we're giving them these agendas that they have to do. So if they're not doing it, they're getting feedback on their rubric, like, you're not doing this, and the instructor would make suggestions, detailed instructions, or detailed suggestions on what that person might do, but yeah, I think it's hard because I think students aren't used to it, and it also depends on why they're in the class. If they're in the class to fade into the back, which some students are, but what was kind of cool was that even those students who tend to fade into the back, you could tell they were much more intently listening. Because, I don't know. I think they were intently listening because you never know when one of your classmates is going to say, but you're this character, what do you think about it? And so students would sort of be, I think they zone out sometimes when the instructor talks, right? So in that way, I think it may circumvent the buy-in because you have to, but yeah, I think that's a big thing. And I think just helping them, like I was talking about, be comfortable with what they're going to do. I think I underestimated the importance of really outlining it. I mean, the instructor did outline it, and I felt like it was explained well, but in hindsight, maybe even more just up front. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So the amount they were producing, I would say during phase 1 and 2 would be comparable to a normal one of my normal classes. I tend to do a lot of discussion, interaction, and so in that way, but they're engaging deeper with a particular content area. In phases 3 and 4, I would say that so in phases 1 and 2, the writing is more emphasis. There's more emphasis on that because they have a lot of homework to recruit allies and write out their character profile. And then in phases 3 and 4, that was much more spontaneous speaking. And so in that way, I think, I don't know how exactly to put it, but it was meaningful because they really had this sort of deep down motivation to communicate, whereas in a traditional class, I would say sometimes they're motivated to chat about whatever the topic is, but in other times they're maybe it's sort of this empty babble that they're saying that may not really have relevance. And so in that way, I might argue it was more relevant or meaningful. And there was certainly, for the more extroverted students, a lot of talking as far as, it's up to you. So you could argue some of the more introverted students were listening more. But I think that relevance and meaningfulness of what you're actually saying is sort of important to note.
I was interested in the question of buy-in as well and motivation.
Mm-hmm.
We even talk about that in my classes sometimes, when they feel motivated, when they don't. Do you think that for this particular study that you did, the motivation was coming from more the topic because they did feel like they had a connection to the topic because it was U.S.-Mexico border, they see it in the media, or do you think it was more the theatrical aspect of you have to convince someone of your point of view and they're going to vote and it's kind of a debate, or where do you, because I'm trying to imagine implementing this in 1004 with a different topic that isn't necessarily, I don't know how successful I could be with it if it weren't something involving Spanglish or immigration or something that they feel like they have a cultural touchstone for, they already know something about. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Was your sense that it more came from the role play, this is your role, you have to convince someone, get into your character, or was it that it was about U.S.-Mexico relations?
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking as you're talking, I don't want to speculate as to why certain students might have been more motivated, but I'll speak more from the data that I didn't share. I think the main motivator was their agendas. So I think from that sense, you could do any well-constructed role immersion simulation, because that's the thing is, how do you make sure that you don't have one side that's automatically, we get it, we're done. You have to have a lot of different, it's sort of like a web of conflicts and initiatives. So that's one thing. The agendas were the main the character was the main, I guess, point of entry for them and motivation for engagement. And then the other motivation that was unexpected, which is in my other data, was that moral dilemmas, students reached the maximum level of agency based on this range I used based on Leo Van Leer created it. And anyway, they reached that mostly, not only, when they were advocating against injustice for a marginalized player. And so they were, they started getting confrontational and saying things like, what? You want to limit their rights of the factor? They're already suffering, things like that. And so those kinds of committed to the scenario or the situation moments so that really was surprising and also good to know as you're creating these that those types, again, touching into the affective realm, right, this moral dilemma, injustice, led students to really start advocating for and engage. Yeah.
Just a quick question. You mentioned this game was designed in 2012, so this scenario was all prepared ahead of time.
So the scenario that I used and based this one off of was developed in English for a US Latino survey class.
Okay.
So it was a role immersion simulation. So I had to cut out some content. I had to add content to scaffold language resources. But yes, the scenario and the characters were modified from that.
So what kind of advice would you have for someone who wanted to create something like this?
Like if someone wanted to just create from scratch something? Ooh. I would say start by going and playing a game, right? Or observing a class where they did it and talking to educators who have implemented the pedagogy. That was invaluable for me to talk to Bridget, the creator of this game. I talked to David Ike, who is doing it at Grand Valley State. I talked to Stephanie Slaughter, and another professor in Michigan, and just really what worked, what didn't, what can I do as somebody who's trying to do this? And I think that would be the most important thing, is to talk to people that have done this, that have created games. And then the reacting to the past is in history, but that's a whole nother resource that they could reach out to. Because I think there are a lot of those unspoken nuances that maybe would be, one might miss if you haven't experienced it. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Did you feel the 4 or 5 weeks was a good amount of time for the role immersion? Or would you have more time, less time? What did the students feel?
So it was 2 days a week for 75 minutes. So the class that I implemented it was 2 days a week, 75 minutes. I thought it was a good amount of time, but I do think if you integrated it more with the curriculum as opposed to it being that separated and allowed a little bit more time for students to ease into it, that might be helpful based on the feedback students gave. So, but overall, I thought it wasn't a bad amount of time for an intermediate class. I have a colleague who's I developed another game as well, or simulation. She's implemented both, but at the 3,000 level. And so she'll do them anywhere from 5 to 6 weeks, to give you an idea. Sure.
Towards the end, when you were going through the pedagogical implications, you said that students need opportunities to explore the unfamiliar, and you said that was something that you felt like was a little bit lacking in your role immersion pedagogy. So I wondered if you could expand on that and like what do you mean by that and how would you do it?
That's a great question. I've reflected on that some, and I don't have a great one, easy answer, but I think, for example, I'll give the El Paso mayor who made her character from California. I would guess, right? I don't know, but I would guess that she didn't have any frame of reference with which to understand what the mayor of El Paso, even though the mayor of Juarez, well, anyway, but so it's really individual. So I think maybe that was part of it. So helping her understand, maybe in the character sheet, or maybe you have a day where you provide everyone with just some additional material to read as homework or something, so they can really understand maybe a complexity that the El Paso mayor would have to deal with, and how would you handle that? So just to give them a little bit more to bite off and chew, besides you're the El Paso mayor and you have these issues that are totally foreign to you that you have to promote. Some people, I think, like the US and Mexican presidents, could found a way to relate to those. And so I think that it's possible that my data didn't show conclusively that this was the case, because I looked at this. Does the character, are those less known characters, are those students less likely to move toward empathy? And my data showed inconclusive, because some had some less known characters and they did progress. But the El Paso mayor, I think, is a good example. You would think maybe the Juarez mayor, because at least the El Paso mayor is from your own country. So it's hard to know, but I think that there's something missing for them to really be able to understand or have a sense of of who this person is or could be, right?
Now that you're teaching 10 of 3, have you thought of examples of ways that you can adapt this to what you would do in 10 of 3?
I think the coordinated sections present added layers of challenges, but I think these kinds of pedagogies, the thing is, reacting to the past has a whole group of people. So like I've implemented this, I have a colleague who's implemented this, but they have a whole group of people before they'll publish a simulation or a game that provide their perspective, provide alternate options. And so I think once you had this game or simulation that was vetted, for lack of a better term, it might make sense to start thinking about implementing it in a coordinated course, but until that point, I think it would be challenging in a coordinated course. As far as 1003, though, their level would be fine. I mean, I think you could implement it. I think the challenges then become professional development and buy-in from the instructor perspective. I don't know what time I'm supposed. I don't want to keep people past. Okay. All right. Thank you.